Working. All right, excellent. Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of the world's most fascinating and essentially... start that again, Neil. You're going to have to cut this one. Sorry. Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of the world's most fascinating and essential contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. A brief message to our listeners. Our stalwart and star producer and talent scout, Malcolm Hughes, has undergone a significant medical procedure yesterday afternoon. As he'll be expected to be in recovery for a while, we may not be putting out podcasts as regularly until Malcolm is back in the chair. We wish Malcolm and his family all our very best, and for Malcolm, a speedy recovery. In this podcast, we'll be talking about Ukraine with Professor Mark Galeotti. Mark is a London-based lecturer and writer on transnational crime and Russian security affairs and director of the consultancy Mayak Intelligence. He is an honorary professor at the University College of London School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies, a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and an associate fellow in Euro-Atlantic geopolitics at the Council on Geostrategy. Mark, welcome to The Focus.
Good to be here.
Mark, as the head of a geopolitical think tank and consultancy, Sage International, here in Adelaide, I, like yourself, have been following the Russian special military operation in Ukraine over the past 2 weeks. As a former soldier in the Armored Corps, I've been surprised by the rookie mistakes that have been made by the Russian army, especially the lack of combined arms operations on the ground in Ukraine. What do you think accounts for this?
I think in many ways what's emerged is the degree to which Ukraine had two secret weapons. One was the genuinely extraordinary, indomitable will of the Ukrainian defenders, and also a military that had been thinking for years about quite how they would tackle the anticipated Russian invasion. And the other secret weapon was Vladimir Putin. What's really striking is the degree to which the Russian military is not, at the moment, fighting the way the Russian military trains, prepares, arms, and equips to fight. And the reason for that seems to be that we've had a political overlay over the general's own capacity to actually run the war. In past operations, it's very much been the case, and this is something that really has gone back really to frankly, the middle of the Second World War, a very clear understanding of what in the West we'd call commander's intent. In other words, that basically the boss tells the generals what he wants achieved, and the generals go out and actually work out the ways of doing so. What happens in this case is that, first of all, Putin seems to have been, well, it's uncertain how far he was genuinely keeping his cards close to his chest for the whole time, or whether he actually was still making policy on the fly. But one way or the other, really, it was only 2 weeks ago that he actually seems to have made the final decision to let his generals know what was going on. So not only did they have relatively limited amount of time to really get their preparations in gear, but also they had limited amount of time to prepare their soldiers, who after all were told they were just there on exercises, not out there to go and fight a bloody war with the people they regard as a fraternal nation. Even more importantly, though, Putin clearly has some very strange ideas about Ukraine. And this has been a leitmotif for many of his speeches and writings for years now, that Ukraine is not a real country, that it's an artificial one, that the Ukrainians are not a real people and such like. And he genuinely seems to have believed that this allegedly sort of neo-fascist regime, a puppet of Washington's, would collapse at the first and lightest push. And to that end, I mean, whereas usually the Russians would begin their operation with what they called a mrau, a massed air artillery strike, there was a preliminary bombardment, but it was relatively limited. And in part, that might have been simply because they wanted to avoid civilian casualties. If you think you're going to quickly take over the country,
I was just going to say, sorry, Mark. I just have to ask you. So you think that there was actually like a deliberate plan somewhere in the chain of command suggesting that they would actually go light on the civilians? This is a very non-Russian way of war in terms of the way that they've been thinking, right?
But this, if you think, though, that basically the country's going to collapse pretty much immediately, and you're going to install a puppet regime, and you don't want to be maintaining massive garrison troops there, then actually doing it as neatly and with as few I hate that term, collateral damage, but civilian casualties is the best. But the main thing was, though, at the same time, they then instead of the kind of massed, coordinated, combined arms operation we'd expect, we saw these little forces of paratroopers, a couple of companies or whatever, trying to motor their way into Kyiv and the other major cities. Now, again, if your basic political assumption is precisely that no one will resist, and in fact, if anything, people may be glad to see you topple this usurper regime, then that's fine. You think that a couple of companies of paratroopers can go in there, grab the main government centers, grab the government, and you're laughing. And it is clear that, the plan seems to have been, the expectation was Kyiv would fall in 2 days and the whole operation was over in 2 weeks. Well, guess what? We're talking 2 weeks in, and the operation is nowhere near them. But again, I think this is it. It's because of Putin's overlay of political assumptions and expectations, and no one could really say, boss, A, that's not accurate, or B, look, just let us do the job. And we're now trying to see the generals trying to sort of make up for that, but it's a bit late.
Is this kind of like Russia's weapons of mass destruction moment? Is it kind of an intelligence failure on a grand scale? Because again, one of the questions that I had for you a little bit further on is that, nothing in this war really makes a great deal of sense. One of the things that struck me as odd was that you have this Russian-speaking city of Kharkiv, which is in the east of Ukraine. And you would have thought that if, Putin was correct in his political assumptions, that, it is a Russian-speaking city, and so therefore, once the tanks roll over the border, the Russian tanks will be greeted by all the babushkas lining up with flowers in their hands, greeting the Russian forces as liberators. And yet what they did was they shelled the living crap out of the city. So what there's something about the way that the war has been fought up to now, which kind of doesn't make sense. It does speak of massive intelligence failures. And obviously, as you rightly point out, that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, or maybe they do, and they're playing off against one another. So there could be some real problems in high command, especially how the military interfaces with the political leadership.
There are certainly those problems. I don't think it's quite the WMD moment, because in that case, it was more that the political leadership that knew what it was doing was demanding that the intelligence services come up with a pretext. In this case, I think that the Russians have good collection capabilities. They clearly have good analytic capabilities. The problem is actually feeding that into the policy process. And I think for some years now, what we've seen is a Putin who is increasingly intolerant of information that doesn't actually fit his prejudices and assumptions. And I remember some years back, talking to a recently retired Russian intelligence officer who said that services have learned that you do not bring bad news to the Tsar's table, was how he put it. Okay. And given that they operate in a very intensively competitive, even cannibalistic environment in which services have in the past devoured other services, everyone is basically having to play the same political games. To get into the room, you have to be saying the right things, which obviously makes a question of quite then, why should you be in the room? But the thing is that in that case, I think exactly no one was going to tell Putin that he was wrong, particularly because now, especially since COVID, the circle of people who actually have physical contact with him has become very, very narrow. And as we saw in the televised meeting of the Security Council before the invasion, where we had the extraordinary sight of the most powerful and frankly often scary figures within the Russian system, looking like terrified school children in front of the principal, wondering who was going to get a whacking. And it turned out to be, in fact, his foreign intelligence chief, whom he bullied mercilessly, smirking all the while, and then allowed that to be shown on national television. This is not an environment that is conducive to a serious and well thought through analysis of the facts on the ground.
Okay, well, in the years leading up to the war, we were told that Russia had invested heavily in modernizing its armed forces. But as we've witnessed, the return on investment doesn't seem to have paid off all that well. The Russian Air Force seems to be missing in action. The first-rate army equipment like armor and artillery have not distinguished themselves. In fact, it seems that the Russian army is having to resort to the blunt instrument of artillery shelling, using the devastating bombardments like what took place in Grozny as its its only real tactical weapon at this point in time. So if the money's poured into the Russian armed forces didn't go into modernizing the weaponry and organization of those armed forces, where did it go?
Well, I mean, we've had periodic warnings from the main military prosecutor's office that at times up to 40% of procurement spending is in fact embezzled. So, I mean, I think the answer is probably it's actually gone into yachts and palaces in some cases.
Yeah.
But at the same time, look, I mean, I don't think it was entirely wasted. We could look at Syria, for example, and see actually a Russian military that is performing the way the Russian military is meant to do when the generals are given the freedom to fight the war their way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the same way as the West, and it certainly doesn't necessarily mean it all nicely. I mean, when we talk about the mass bombardment of cities, the awful truth of the matter is that's how the Russian army intends to fight urban warfare. Urban warfare is hard. Shelling cities, depopulating them, and then planting a flag on the rubble is rather easier. So in some ways, actually, what we're seeing is the beginning of a Grozny or Syria, Aleppo scenario being applied to Ukraine. But I think, yes, it's this issue of once you start on the wrong foot, it's really quite difficult to then adapt. The Russians, for example, because they didn't launch the kind of full-scale and preliminary bombardment they normally would, they weren't able to wipe out Ukraine's air defenses. And therefore, the skies are still to a degree contested. Because they basically ended up with logistics just for a 2-week war, because that's what the boss was certain it was going to be, they're now finding serious problems running out of all the necessary, I mean, not just fuel, oil, and lubricants, but actually even food for the soldiers, which is one of the reasons why we've seen looting. I mean, all of these actually are in many ways traced back to the start of the war and the concept of the war. And, this is why, I mean, it's interesting that we're now seriously talking about a possibility in which the Ukrainians might actually win on the battlefield, which is not something we thought was possible. And that is a conceivable outcome. But I still don't think we should necessarily rule out the Russian military. They're calling up conscripts, they're calling up reservists, not the best troops to have, but nonetheless, warm bodies. They're clearly sort of moving forces. There are all kind of additional assets they could use, including the air power, if they're willing to accept more losses. So I think there is a chance, particularly because Putin is beginning to shift his negotiation position, and he presumably would rather negotiate from a position of strength. So I think we're going to see a redoubled effort in the next week or so to take at least 1 or 2 more cities, ideally from the Russians' point of view, Kyiv.
Former commanding general of the US Army in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, said rather triumphantly that what we are witnessing in Ukraine are Russian weaknesses, not strengths. If this is true, we are unlikely to see any expansion of this war to include NATO now or in the near term. American analyst, on the other hand, Peter Zian, has suggested that Putin's grand strategy is to close all potential access points to Russia, what he calls Russia's 9 gateways. During the USSR, Russia controlled all 9 gateways. After 1992, Russia controlled only 2. In 2014, Putin's seizure of Crimea allowed Russia to control an extra gateway, going from 2 to 3. From how I see things, I can't see this grand objective being met at all, because controlling the other gateways would require war with Romania, Poland, and the Baltic states, all NATO members protected by Article 5. What's your take?
No, I agree. I don't see any intention to actually expand this war to NATO for several reasons. One is that the Russians are entirely aware of the degree to which NATO is vastly more powerful. I mean, remember, European NATO, without even the Americans or the Canadians, has more ground troops than the Russians have, and in many cases, rather better ones. Secondly, there is no real belief that Article 5 is anything other than ironclad. This is the interesting thing. In the West, we often worry, would Spain fight for Estonia and such like? Because the Russians have a tendency, like all of us, I suppose, to mirror image. I mean, they ultimately see NATO as America's Warsaw Pact. So they don't think Spain would get a choice as to whether it fights for Estonia. So they think that sort of NATO absolutely would hang together. And thirdly, I suspect that the sort of geostrategic dimension would be an overlay in how Putin thinks about this. This is much more primal and visceral. Ukraine, as far as he's concerned, is part of Russia's rightful historical, cultural patrimony. He can't be the Tsar who lost Ukraine. And more generally, how dare, in his view, the Ukrainians think they could actually chart an entirely independent course? How dare they think that they could become members of the European Union and NATO, turning their back on Moscow? So I said, I think this is the interesting thing. What we have seen in recent speeches on the subject of the war is a very different Putin from the one we're used to. We're used to him projecting the image of the cold, calm chief executive stroke James Bond movie mastermind, evil. What we've actually seen is a much more emotional, visceral Putin. So I think this is actually much more of a personal crusade than something that can be explained by sort of interesting theories of geostrategic access.
Interesting you should say this, because while I was listening to speak, I just had the thought, and that was, if Putin plays to his own prejudices, if he's the Tsar and he's not listening to his advisors, irrespective of what they say to him, could it be possible then that he will overestimate and overextend in spite of what we would consider a rational move? That maybe he thinks NATO is weak and that it is fragile, and that by continuing to push in a certain direction, he will get what he wants, which is, well, one of the things that he wants is to break up NATO. And so therefore, pushing the West Europeans into a form of chaos, if you will. I mean, do you think that that's possible? Because if it operates at one level, it has to operate in another, right?
I mean, it might have been possible before this war. But when you have the Russian military machine taking really quite substantial losses, I mean, even if we take the lowest end of the independent estimates of Russian casualties, which are less than half what the Ukrainians are claiming, but okay, let's be incredibly conservative and basically suggest that they've taken 5,000 casualties already in 2 weeks. That is the same amount of casualties as the Soviet Union sustained in the first 3 full years of war in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And the Soviets had an army that was 3 times as large. And this war is not over. And they're suffering extraordinary damage, not just obviously to their physical capabilities, but also I think the morale and discipline. This is not an army that is about to then pivot and start taking on NATO. So, I mean, I think that maybe it was a conceivable thing he could have sort of toyed with in his mind a month ago, though I see no real evidence of it. Again, I think NATO is an antagonist. It's not, I mean, it goes back to, it's a phrase that Putin once used that I thought was tremendously illustrative of his mindset. He was actually talking to a fairly independent-minded journalist, and he said, look, there are enemies and there are traitors. Enemies you fight against, but the point is someday you hope to be able to reach some kind of a deal with them. Traitors you can do nothing with. Traitors you just have to wipe out. NATO is an enemy. As far as he's concerned, the Ukrainians are traitors.
Right. Yep. So John Mearsheimer has been doing the rounds on YouTube in particular, and I'm not so sure what you think about his ideas, but I'll just, for our listeners' sake, say that the long and the short of it is that he does blame the West for what we're currently seeing. We didn't listen to Putin back in 2008. We allowed, or at least, well, I suppose allowed, tentatively gave it permission for NATO to expand further and further east, which kind of freaked out the Kremlin, freaked out Putin in particular. But, isn't there a time and a place where you have to say to yourself, was it not up to former Warsaw Pact states to make the decision for themselves after having suffered decades under the Soviet yoke to finally rid themselves of any likelihood of the Russians coming to play in their backyards all over again? There's that whole push-pull factor about NATO. It wasn't just about, the Americans orchestrated this entire push and it's designed specifically to weaken Russia. This was about, sovereign people making a decision to say, never again, we're not going to have the Russians standing on our necks. Why doesn't that seem to be doing the rounds as well in the YouTube environment?
Well, I honestly think that Mearsheimer is not currently doing his reputation any favors. Because the interesting thing is that much of what he says is technically true, but also entirely irrelevant.
Correct.
I mean, it's a little bit like, and this is in some ways a rather trivial kind of example, but the mugger who is arrested after beating someone up to try and steal their cell phone. Yes, maybe that mugger had a very hard childhood, and that helps explain why he became that instead of a productive member of society. But when it comes down to it, it was the mugger's decision to actually launch the attack. We're in that kind of situation. It is perfectly true that the Russians were, well, Soviets were originally given a promise that NATO would not expand eastwards. And we have not done ourselves any favors by essentially our response being, well, you never got it in writing.
Yeah.
Which is true, but it contributes to a Russian sense that basically the West, we are sanctimonious hypocrites, that we will say whatever and then cheat them if we can get away with it. And yes, I mean, it's perfectly true that, look, I lived in Prague for several years, and I could totally understand why, from the Czechs' point of view, being a member of NATO was really important, both for practical security reasons, exactly, never again are we going to be subject to Russian pressure, but also because it was a member of the Winners' Club. And there was a psychological as well as dimension to that. All that said, look, I mean, yes, we have, I think in the West, we managed to mishandle Russia dramatically. And in fact, it predates Putin. The 1990s was a period of horrifically bad policymaking. And it wasn't just simply that we basically treated Russia as a problem rather than a partner. The very time we were being so amenable to these ex-Soviet states, as in the Baltic, ex-Warsaw Pact states, Central Europe, we really weren't that interested in Russia. We also were very, I think, sort of pragmatic to the extreme in that, for example, when the then President Boris Yeltsin shelled his own parliament, because it was an unpleasant parliament, hold back from the Soviet days, but still, constitutionally, he was no longer president. But we didn't like that parliament, so we applauded him. 1996, it looked as if he was going to lose elections to the communists. But we didn't want the communists to win either. So when he rigged the election, we applauded him. And then we are surprised that people like Putin think that democracy is actually a sham anyway. I mean, the trouble is, in some ways, we didn't necessarily sort of create a Putin himself, but we certainly created situations in which a Putin was more likely to rise. But as I said, when it comes down to it, none of this matters. Sure, let's have the academic debates after the event to help inform how we act in the future, because this is one of my key issues. I think that the West and Ukraine are going to win this one. Quite how quickly and what that means, we'll have to wait and see. But I think the combination of Ukrainian resistance on the ground and the absolute hammer blow of economic warfare that is being waged against Russia will ultimately bring down this Putinist system, shall we say. No, not necessarily quickly. But I don't think we're really thinking yet about how we then win the peace, because it'll give us a chance to try and make up for the failures of post-1991.
In a recent tweet, I put out that, from my observations, I think that we're fighting the last Soviet-style war with Soviet generals and a Soviet army, and everything is, I mean, we tend to think that, 1992 came and went, and that was the end of the Soviet Union, but it actually hung on in a life support capacity under the guise of the Putin regime, Russian Federation. It took on all the mantle and, of course, all that sort of cultural bravado that went with it. So really what you're suggesting is that now we're seeing a historic or potential historic turning point where at the end of this war, the Soviet Union will finally be put in its grave and we'll have a new political elite in Russia, maybe not anything that will, look like what happens in the UK or Australia or the United States, but at least something that we can cooperate with and maybe even roll into the Western security architecture if the offer was extended.
Very much so. I mean, again, I think this is the interesting thing. If one looks at Putin and his inner circle, on the whole, they are, like him, 69, 70, 71 or 72-year-olds.
Yeah.
Like him, they are, to a large extent, products of the old Soviet KGB. And I'm not saying they are, that one can explain everything from a KGB background. That's a sort of a ridiculous caricature. But they are very much that last gasp Homo Sovieticus. And a lot of their assumptions are really deeply rooted both in what happened in Soviet times and also, and look, I'm talking to you from London. We in the UK know that losing an empire is hard and it takes quite a long time to get over it. And I'm not quite sure we still have. So we shouldn't be surprised that it's difficult for the Russians to come to terms with moving from being one of the two global superpowers to a significant second-rank power. You know, Russia is not insignificant in many ways. It's certainly not these kind of ridiculous stereotypes of, you know, a gas station with nukes or anything like that. But yes, I mean, I think this is very much that generation's last chance at revenge, because their sense of what have we lost has in many ways metastasized into and who took it from us. It's a very paranoid, conspiratorial view of the world in which, you know, even the Ukrainian revolution of 2013, 2014 was clearly made in Langley. It was clearly part of some subversive campaign to marginalize Russia. If I look at, shall I say, the 55 to 65-year-olds, the next immediate generation in the magazine ready to be deployed, the thing that strikes me is, yes, I mean, these are not necessarily nice people. These are ruthless, pragmatic kleptocrats. But that's okay, because we're in the West. We deal with ruthless, pragmatic kleptocrats all the time. But the point is, what I don't see amongst them is this, as I said, very kind of visceral anger toward the West. They are nationalists, maybe, patriots, certainly. They want to see Russia in a strong position in the world, but they don't necessarily want to see NATO in the West stabbed just for the joy of watching it bleed. And I think that's going to be a very important transition. Plus, if I can quickly jump on another hobby horse, Russia is on the cusp of one of the largest intergenerational transfers of wealth the world has ever seen. The kind of the oligarch generation, the people who stole on an industrial scale in the 1990s, are beginning to think about their sort of their own succession planning. And they're looking at their kids and so forth, and they're thinking that, you know, I don't want them to have to fight the way I did. Or as they look at the pampered little darlings, I don't think they could. In that situation, rule of law, which is the thing that Russia has lacked, rule of law becomes important for them. It becomes a way of fixing your theft, of essentially legitimizing everything that you've stolen and allowing you to safely transfer it to your heirs or whoever. And the interesting thing is, you can have rule of law without democracy, but you can't have democracy without rule of law. So in some ways, I think the post-Putin political generation will precisely be, you know, unpleasant thieves at home who want better relations with the West because they want to use our banking system and to buy penthouses in London and so forth. But it will also be the rule of law generation where it is imposed. And that means maybe then the next political generation might begin to become what we might think of as the democratic reforming Russia.
So that's actually quite an optimistic outcome.
It is unfashionably optimistic, yes.
So, okay, Mark, how NATO handled certain elements. I mean, we can all sit back and marvel with how it basically just snapped together after having been in this, I like to call it the Al Bundy funk, you know, that married with children funk, where every state to itself and everyone's bickering. But then it takes that external factor to bring everyone together and no one messes with the family. And Putin has delivered that for us, for the West, I should say. So in that sense, you know, there haven't been many things that NATO had done wrong, although one could say perhaps the idea of a no-fly zone was not necessarily handled in the best way, but more particularly that whole issue with Polish fighter jets for the Ukrainian Air Force. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, look, I think we have to be aware of the fact, I mean, there is a lot of talk from particularly kind of civilian leaderships that don't really know much about military affairs, suddenly now all become military experts. And some of the talk about, you know, a no-fly zone could just as easily be called an aerial combat zone. Yep. There is a sense that it is a little bit kind of Harry Potter, that someone waves a magic wand and suddenly all planes are grounded.
Yes.
We are also obviously looking at ways of supporting the Ukrainians, and that's absolutely vital. But again, there is an element that, you know, there's always politics involved. There is a degree to which different countries and different leaderships are trying to grandstand, are trying to, you know, present themselves in certain ways, except, of course, the British government, which wouldn't even dream of making political capital out of a convenient war that distracts everyone from domestic political crises. Yeah. When it comes to this, I mean, I'll be honest, this notion of just simply handing over a bunch of reconditioned MiG-29s to the Ukrainians, in my opinion, was never really a runner. First of all, these have been reconditioned and thoroughly modernized. So actually, Ukrainian pilots who are used to MiG-29s of their own sort would have to spend quite a while training up to be able to use these properly. Secondly, look, as you well know, a plane is just an expensive jet engine unless it's got the whole infrastructure of proper runways and bunkers and hangars and equipment and the radars and everything else.
Yeah.
And I think it's fairly clear that if there was going to be some massive upgrade to Ukraine's aerial capabilities, well, the Russians would just basically crater every single runway in Western Ukraine, which is something that's well within their capabilities, using Kalib and Iskander missiles without even having to launch air raids. And then you'd have just a very expensive trophy, basically. So in the circumstances, I can understand why actually America didn't want to politically involve itself in something that would be militarily redundant, but also potentially inflammatory with the Russians. I mean, this is the interesting dance. There's no question but that the West is currently at war with Russia, but right. It is a non-kinetic war. It is, sanctions. Sanctions is the way we talk about economic war because we don't like the word war being in our policy discourse. But and it's not just sanctions, it's also, wider cultural and political conflict that is taking place. I mean, this is a really interesting kind of asymmetric conflict in which, the Russians are large, although they're beginning to launch their counter-sanctions, but they are largely fighting their war with tanks and guns. And we in the West are fighting our war with, well, what one could almost call proxies in Ukraine, but mainly non-kinetic means. And I think the point is that actually these kind of sort of signaling opportunities can get lost. Unfortunately, what then the story becomes is not that, in fact, the West is united in delivering this major blow to Russia, but it becomes a spat between Poland and the United States and, who was in the right and who was in the wrong. And said, I think this was, in my opinion, a bit of Polish grandstanding to make this public.
Okay. So, we've heard a lot in the media about the likelihood of Vladimir Putin launching tactical nuclear weapons inside Ukraine to shock the world and bring the war to a favorable conclusion. Considering the fact that, the Russian army has, as we've made mention earlier, is making rather slow progress in seizing various strategic cities in Ukraine, is this a distinct possibility? I mean, we've heard him say, or at least warn the West that it's a possibility that, he will bring that card to the table. Do you think that this is real or just bluff?
Look, it's very difficult at the moment to rule anything out, because the thing is that the old Putin was cautious and risk averse. For all the macho posturing and the, bare-chested, on horseback and so forth, he actually was very well aware of the dangers of escalation. Yeah. On the other hand, for whatever reason, we do seem to be seeing a kind of a new iteration of Putin. And whether it's age or the fact that no one should be spending 22 years in power, whether it's actually the impact of COVID, whether, as some suggest, he's ill, but one way or the other, he definitely does sound like an angry old man in a hurry. Yeah. And therefore, things that once upon a time seemed inconceivable now become a little bit less so. So I would be sort of hesitant to say, no, it's not possible. I mean, it's worth noting that such a use of tactical nuclear weapons is not envisaged within Russian military doctrine. There are some claims that Russia has an escalate to de-escalate strategy, whereby they sort of make gains on the battlefield and then, launch a little nuke just to say, allow us to take this. Let's just kind of end the war now at our high watermark. So, I mean, it's not actually, though, the case that the Russians do think in those terms. But again, what it comes down to is I don't get the sense at the moment that the generals are calling the shots. And it may be that to a political leadership who are, desperate to make some kind of gains, to not have this to be a defeat that sort of becomes a defining defeat of the regime, it may be that they think that that becomes conceivable. However, I think it's more likely we will see, if we're going to see that kind of an escalation, I think chemical weapons, which are already being sort of warned about. I think chemical weapons represents more of a, I mean, again, a ghastly war crime, but we've already seen maternity hospital shelled and so forth. Once you've got a few war crimes under your belt, the next one, alas, seems all too easy. And therefore, we might see something like that. There is something about the N word, the nuclear weapons, that really does represent not just a rhetorical, but a practical escalation. And I think there'll be also a lot of people in various command circles in Russia that would start getting truly scared if people started thinking about putting nuclear weapons in the field. So, as I say, I couldn't possibly rule this out, but I'm still not at the point where I think it's a likelihood.
Mark, why is Alexei Navalny still alive? I mean, why is he allowed to Twitter anti-Putin statements from jail? And does this suggest that Russian intelligence agencies are hedging their bets with Putin?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say intelligence agencies, but certainly there are figures within the government that are hedging their bets. And I think, again, there is this constant political calculation that, and has been around for a while. Again, I think it's much, much more marked now. But, even sort of a couple of years ago, before COVID, there were people who were clearly thinking that, this regime will ultimately come to an end. And we will need to be able to demonstrate that although we are insiders, we were still secretly on the side of good. And we do know that there were people who were channeling money to Navalny's organization and information, particularly the kind of leaks that then led to his splendidly coruscating video takedowns of corrupt officials. Some of that came from insiders, or at least the sort of the first, you might want to look at this particular account types of information. So yes, there was an element of that. I think from the state's point of view, having made the decision, I think they decided more or less that they were going to, just roll everything up, not just put Navalny behind bars or indeed try and kill him, but also his organization and every other real sign of any kind of independent political activism, to do a clean sweep well in advance of the 2024 presidential elections, to try and ensure that they had to do, obviously they would be rigging heavily, but they were trying to do the least amount of rigging possible, because they had seen in Belarus what happens if you just simply announce an insultingly obvious result for the elections. Yeah. But I think then, having decided that they were going to put him behind bars, that maybe he would be more of a problem in terms of the West and in terms of Russia at home, as a dead martyr rather than a living symbol. And they hoped that someday he could be politically neutered to the point where he could then be released, and then the state can say, well, he was a convicted criminal, he served his time, and out he went. That's what we law-governed states do, without having to fear his political impact. Yeah. I mean, but I think the interesting thing is the fact that they have launched new proceedings against him, which will clearly keep him in prison for a long, long time, is actually sign of a new concern about not just Navalny personally, but the whole prospect of political opposition generally. And, having done this, having kept him alive, you put him behind bars. Occasionally, yes, there can be some tweets coming out. But I think from their point of view, he's the least of their worries at the moment.
So finally, Mark, what do you think a negotiated settlement, if it does come about with Putin in power, what will that mean for Ukraine? I mean, it's obviously not going to be back to the pre-invasion borders. I mean, there will be territorial swathes of Ukrainian territory that will be belonging to Russia after this. And if that's the case, I mean, how do you think average Ukrainians who have been so disrupted by all of this, how are they going to feel about all these kind of negotiations?
When it comes down to it, I mean, although we are seeing the beginning of a negotiation process, I think obviously from the Ukrainians' point of view, they would like to see an end to the war. It's nice not to be shelled, I understand. The interesting thing is that we've already seen actually the Kremlin scaling down its expectations and demands. I mean, originally they were talking about quote unquote denazification. I mean, a particularly obscene suggestion anyway, but that carries with it the implication of imposing political control over the whole country, because that's the only way you can actually denazify Ukraine. On Monday, instead, what we had was a new sort of essentially starting point for peace negotiations, in which they're saying they're perfectly happy to withdraw, so long as, and there's a whole series of various clauses, which at the moment are entirely unacceptable to Ukraine with good reason, involving things like becoming enforced neutrality and such like, which would leave it vulnerable to any other time the Russians wanted to invade. But perhaps most telling was the fact that all it really required in territorial terms was a recognition of the annexation of Crimea and likewise of the eastern Donbass region. Now, as I said, I think that's not in and of itself an acceptable terms yet for the Ukrainians, but it gives us a sense of the fact that actually Russia is realizing that it cannot You cannot conquer all of Ukraine, let alone pacify it. Remember, Afghanistan, a country the same size as Ukraine, the Soviets maintained between their own and the Afghan government forces 250,000 men in country. Well, today's Russia can't do that. So I think that, increasingly, we're likely to see that if there is some kind of territorial deal, it will mean cutting off all or part of the Donbass region, which is not necessarily a bad thing for Ukraine. I mean, to be honest, the tragedy of the Donbass is that actually it was a region that nobody wants. Russia stirred up this insurgency within it, not because it cared about the Russian speakers of the Donbass, but purely as a lever against Kyiv. And, Kyiv continued to push on a political level to say that we want the Donbass back and everything else, while actually not having any desire for this area. And if Putin had been truly Machiavellian, he would have just handed the Donbass to Kyiv and said, there you go, I wish you all the joy of trying to reintegrate this economically ruined region full of disgruntled warlords with lots and lots of guns. Have a nice life. But Putin actually is much, much less Machiavellian than many people assume. And there was always that sense of, well, one more push and Kyiv will capitulate to our terms. Well, obviously it never happened. And this is where they're in now. But the interesting thing is that, yes, so Ukraine might, for the moment, lose. I mean, I think Crimea, no Russian ruler for the foreseeable future will be able to abandon Crimea. It's a peninsula that pretty much every Russian, whether they love Putin or hate him, regard as rightfully theirs, because it was until 1954. The Donbass, well, we'll have to wait and see. Well, it'll be interesting whether the people of the Donbass would rather be parts of Ukraine or parts of Russia. But perhaps most importantly of all is I think that it's not just that Putin has reinvigorated NATO. He has done something that successive Ukrainian leaders have failed to do, which is actually create a properly integrated Ukrainian people and state. Yeah. And the irony is that, one almost feels that statues of Putin should be put up in all the main squares in Ukraine, because he is the true Ukrainian state builder. Up to that point, I mean, especially since 1991, we had seen a sequence of what we might call partial but never quite carried through attempts at state building in Ukraine. There were still, umpteen divisions, particularly between East and West, Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, and indeed others. There were all kinds of deeply problematic political factions and clans, some oligarch-driven, some politically driven, and such like. And there was a deep vociferousness within Ukrainian society. Now a lot of that has been swept away. I mean, it was swept away even before the invasion, and one could see that in the election of President Zelensky, who managed to appeal to every constituency within Russia, within Ukraine. But I think absolutely now we will see a coherent, unified Ukrainian state, which, whether or not it's able to join NATO imminently, join the European Union imminently, but nonetheless has convincingly reorientated itself westwards. This will never again be a fraternal nation to the Russians. Or, well, I say never, not for generations. The notion that Kyiv was the mother of Russian cities, well, I think this is going to be a mother that very much will want to disown its children. So I think that's the real future for Ukraine now.
Yeah. Mark, thank you for sharing your insights on the focus. It was absolutely a pleasure having you on.
My pleasure indeed.
Thank you. University College of London's Professor Mark Galeotti. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our guest, Mark Galeotti, and to producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find The Focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you like what you've heard, please like and review us on your favorite podcasting platform. Until next time, I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to Sage International's The Focus. That was awesome. Really. I mean, I've seen you on TV down here. Boy, it was a privilege having you on.
Oh, my pleasure. I mean, I will confess, I'm slightly peeved I didn't get to plug my